there's another strand which we have to understand. The core of SCLC was nonviolent direct action. Now, in one sense, you have to understand, as Gandhi understood, that nonviolent direct action actually needs the oppressor to act true to the oppressor's nature. And how does an oppressor react when you are nonviolent and taking direct action? Does it obey the rules of democracy? Have you read what happened to that Iraq veteran at Oakland in the occupying, they had a tent city there. The Oakland police not only used batons, they were using tear gas canisters directly fired into the tent areas, and this guy now has brain damage. He survived 2 tours of duty in Iraq, and he's now probably going to be severely brain damaged. So how have they replied in New York? What will happen in St. Paul's, perhaps? In other words, the people with power like the idea of nonviolence by other people, but if you get in the way. Now, what the nonviolent direct action meant was it required for media coverage, and again, media coverage not just in the US, but media coverage around the world. It required the police chief in Birmingham, Alabama, or in Albany, Georgia, to use the police dogs, to use the water hoses on 12-year-old children and 9-year-old children. They had to do that because that was their nature. And once they did that, then you could label them. And even the media would then say, this is terrible, and that creates pressure on the political leadership to actually do something. Well, Malcolm X, who had come out of the Nation of Islam, but moved the nation, moved people listening to him into more political engagement, he says, no, we have the right of self-defense. If we defend ourselves, then they won't do that against us. If they fear that we will take action against them for their violence inflicted upon us, they won't inflict the violence upon us. Now, it's very different. But in fact, the mainstream civil rights movement needed Malcolm X. And all the evidence is that the more Malcolm X got support, the more money was donated by the foundations to the mainstream civil rights groups. The more Malcolm X seemed a threat, the more the civil rights groups were able to tell Kennedy and Johnson and the people in power, if you don't give it to us, you'll have to deal with them. And out of this, of course, comes Kennedy offers this, introduces in July 1963 Civil Rights Bill, very limited. It doesn't include employment or whatever. It's the burning of the Baptist Church, 16th Street, the firebombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, where 4 young black girls are murdered. It involves, eventually, of course, all these campaigns, and it involves the assassination of Kennedy himself, for Congress to finally pass a stronger bill. But even to get the stronger bill through, it required great breaking of the filibuster and concessions, so that the bill was not as strong as the House version. But it's interesting to know what the Southerners wanted. Senator Richard Russell said, "We will resist to the bitter end any measure or any movement which would have a tendency to bring about social equality and intermingling and amalgamation of the races in our southern states." Now, the bill is passed, but in 1964, you have more pressure from COFO, the coordinated organization of the different organizations, come together, and they need a voting rights bill to protect the rights of black people to vote, because there's all these legal means and terror means. To get it, you have campaigns, and again, you've heard about Albany, Selma, Alabama, the Selma to Montgomery March. You've seen videos, I'm sure, about this. You've read about that. And again, we have, in the handouts, we have the names of 41 people who died, who were murdered during this period. And you have Viola Liuzzo, Reverend James Reeby, and Jimmy Lee Jackson, among others, who were killed at that time. But Mississippi Freedom Summer has, I'd like to talk about this, has those are when they're missing, it's Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney. They were SNCC workers in Mississippi. They were arrested by a sheriff in Philadelphia, Mississippi, held until they could be turned over to the Ku Klux Klan. When the bodies were eventually found, well, while they were searching for the bodies, they found half of a black man's body. But it wasn't James Chaney's. The pathologist said that Goodman and Schwerner were shot and killed, shot in the head and murdered before their bodies were dumped. James Chaney, a Mississippi African-American, suffered injuries, according to the pathologist, comparable with a severe auto or plane crash before he died. Now, I'd like to raise with you, put yourselves, if you can, in the mind of a young, your age, African-American in 1964. You're engaged in the civil rights struggle. You're engaged in the Mississippi Freedom Movement. You're engaged in the struggle for racial justice. And you know the reason Johnson responded so vigorously when the bodies were found and forced the FBI to actually do something. And the reason eventually we get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where he delivered one of his most impassioned speeches, was not because 3 civil rights workers were killed. Why do you think? Because 2 of the 3 were white. And the atmosphere. I know people who were in the training camps because they went down in waves. They were in Antioch University. And the phones, when the bodies were found, indeed, they knew when they didn't call in that night, all the SNCC people knew that they were dead. Because you were under very strict rules, because you were being attacked and so on. You knew you had to phone in regularly. When they didn't phone in that night and they found out they'd been held by the police in Philadelphia and then released, they knew that they were dead. The phones didn't stop ringing in the training centers. Parents of the volunteers were ringing saying, you've done it all. You've done as much as you can, but you've got to come home. We can't risk your life. And they stayed. And they went down. Human beings can change history with courage and dignity. But think of what it meant that those 2 lives could have such an impact. Not because they were human beings, but because they were white human beings. This is what racism does to destroy a society. And this is what it does in terms of how people must have felt, knowing that, in fact, one reason why they had to have so many white volunteers was to actually try to limit the violence that would be inflicted upon them.